Many times in my career, I have seen where a company does not align to the Agile principles. So you may have stand-ups, and you may have a backlog, and you may do refinements, you may have sprints, but if your company isn't aligned with the principles of agility, are you really agile? Let's think about what that means for a second. I would like to take each principle of agility and talk about it a little more in detail, so that maybe if you're in a company or you're on a team who are going through some of the Scrum events, or maybe you have a Kanban team, or maybe you're a product owner or product manager, and you're sort of in that space where you don't have a Scrum Master that you're working with, and your team is sort of pseudo-agile, or maybe you have agile events, but they're really just repurposed versions of project management events, then maybe some of these will ring true for you. So I want to walk through some of the agile principles. So let's just start from number one at the top of the list. So our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. I think the key statement in that is early and continuous delivery, right? So in your standard project management methodology, the way to know that you are operating in your standard project management command and control world and not in the agile world, I think with this item you'll quickly realize that early and continuous delivery of valuable software means you're sending things to the customer and you're getting the customer feedback. So whether that means that you have some sort of middle ground environment that you can expose to the customer, or whether you can walk the customer through, if you're a product owner or a product manager, whether you can walk the customer through the latest deployment of your software and kind of show them the different features, that this is your highest priority. Satisfy the customer early through continuous delivery, early and continuous delivery, right? So if you're in an old school project management shop, you will not deliver anything to the customer until everything is done. So the customer may have to wait months, maybe 3 months, 6 months, until they see any software at all. And by the time that you show them software, they will immediately have feedback, and that leads you to having to do changes. And like large projects and large organizations, they'll have methods. Usually people that have traditional project management, they'll have methods to deal with this. They'll have product change requests, and they'll go through and they'll say this deviates from the originally agreed on requirements, and they'll have sign-offs and stuff when requirements are changed, right? That's counter to what this item is saying. This item is saying complete some software, give it to the customer, get some feedback, come back and use that to plan your next iteration, right? Let's move on to number 2. Welcome changing requirements even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. I think the key thing in that for me is welcome changing requirements. The key thing for me is even late in development, right? Let's take it back to the world of project management. Let's say you've been working on 6 months on this piece of software. You give it to the customer, and they ask you to make a few little minor tweaks. Well, those few minor tweaks now become a massive change. You have to get your business analysts involved. They have to amend requirements. They have to have a document of the requirements as they looked on a certain date and signed off on a certain date. Now they have to document the differences after. They have to document the differences asked for by the customer, and then get a change request to show that this was the original requirement. These are the requirements that we're changing. Here's the before and after. They'll detail in line every single one. That's sort of what this one is talking about. So welcoming changing requirements, it's more of setting a culture of we want the customer's input at every stage while we're building things. And if the customer wants something different, we want to make that change as early as possible, and if possible, while we're working on that module. Because there's a thing in development, and developers will probably go along with me with this, is while we're in that piece of code, we would rather get all of the changes, even if we have to stop what we're working on, we'd rather get all the changes for that piece of the code while we're working on it. So then and if you look at it from a financial perspective, the cost of changing something is much cheaper if you already have that patient on the operating table. It's much cheaper to just do the change there and then while you're already in the middle of the surgery, right? This kind of goes back to always be communicating with the customer. Oh, that's like an ABC thing. Always be communicating. Less boiler room. Anyway. Number 3 is deliver working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference to the shorter time scale. I feel the first thing that I feel that if there's anything that dates the Agile Manifesto, this probably dates it from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, because now, even in my career, a lot of the software I've worked on, you had the ability to release pretty much every day. And like, for example, if you find a bug and it's included in the sprint and development fixes that bug, you want that bug to go out to production as soon as, most people in my career don't have a strong automation testing rolled into their software development practices. But let's say as soon as the item is fixed through development and tested, you want that item to go to production as soon as possible, by itself, if possible, in some sort of release by itself. So there's less cost of change and less change management in the cost of the item. But I understand when this was written in the project management, command and control era of software development, this was written in the phase of you would do all the requirements and you try to have the cost of change be minimal and the cost of taking on something unknown be minimal. And this sort of pushes in the opposite direction. It says we want to deliver software as fast as possible to the customer, because delivering as fast as possible means we're going to get feedback as fast as possible. And feedback means we'll be working on the most valuable thing in the most valuable order. Theoretically. It doesn't always work that way, but usually. Number 4, business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. I feel this item probably is a throwback to when business analysts basically wrote all the requirements and were a separation between the customers and the development team. And possibly the development team didn't have a product owner. Maybe they all work for a technical lead or a development manager of some sort. Now, with product owners kind of becoming the norm, or product owner or product managers or product organizations being built out inside of organizations, small and large, this one I feel probably is getting a bit more attention than these other items inside of companies. But if you're on a development team and you don't talk to customers ever, right? You only ever talk to your business analysts, or maybe you have a product. Maybe you're in a larger organization and you have a product owner and they have a business analyst, and you only ever talk to the two of them. Maybe it's time to talk about this one in retrospective, which is business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. When I was a product owner, I would try to be as available as possible to my team whenever they needed me. I never wanted a bottleneck to be the team's understanding of a business problem or the team's understanding of a issue from the perspective of a customer. And if the developers do not have direct access to customers or a pool of customers they can pull on at any moment, then the product owner and the business analyst who is in service of that product owner can step in to fill that role. Number 5, build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and support their needs, and trust them to get the job done. Again, this is kind of a throwback to me where you had project managers and you basically go and pull from your pool of project managers to go spin something up and throw it out there. I'm not really sure how much this item is still relevant. I guess in sort of more traditional / old school companies, maybe this item would still be hyper relevant, where projects are built around project managers who are kind of temporarily there while the project's going on, and then they kind of rock star out of there. I would think you wouldn't want to build projects. You would want to build products, and then products will have product owners, and those product owners will stay with the product and all of its projects to the end of life of that product. I feel this one kind of has morphed and changed over the years. But I do understand you want to build products around people that are actually the domain experts, or that really believe in those products, or that are responsible or empowered by the company for the future of those products. And then around them, you give them a team, developers, testers, business analysts, whatever, and then you let them run in a direction and you kind of trust them. Basically, you fund the team and the team runs in a direction, right? And that's sort of what this item means to me. Now, I probably could talk kind of all day about what happens at larger companies, what happens at smaller companies. Sometimes a smaller company works on different products or a couple different products. I think it's a little flexible in that the product owner could be a role and not a permanent job. But I think it all could be contained within the same sphere. All those tools kind of come out of the same box. Moving on to number 6, the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. This is an interesting one because of everything that happened in 2020 and the world kind of moving to more remote. But I don't think there'll be a lot of argument about the most efficient and effective method of conveying information is face-to-face. I don't think there's a lot of pushback on that one. Now, you could say physically face-to-face, right? Because that's this item was made long before remote working was as efficient as it is now, right? Remote working back in the early 2000s was nowhere near as efficient or effective as it is now. However, I still say this, and maybe some of my peers in the field will disagree. I'm open to being questioned on this one. I feel that physical co-location, so physical face-to-face conversations and interactions, are superior to online face-to-face, like Zoom or Google Hangouts or Microsoft Teams or whatever other software that people are using to have face-to-face interactions. They're okay, and they're much better than a phone call or a teleconference where everyone has their video shut off, right? It's better to see people's faces. However, the most effective method is when everyone is physically sitting in the same room. Because in the same room, there's a certain level of team bonding that goes on. There's a certain level of crosstalk, cross-chatter. I don't know a good way to say. There's a certain level of information sharing that everyone gets to participate in, right? You can overhear conversations that are going on about the software, or you can hear about how two developers are thinking about coding something, or you can hear how the QA person is talking through testing something with somebody from the business, or you can hear the product owner discussing with people from the business the requirements, right? Things that the business needs them to build. There's a lot of information that flows back and forth within the development team that you just can't take advantage of when people are not physically co-located. Like I said, 2020 kind of changed all the rules for this item. But even if we were to go to a world where, even if we were to transition to a world where everybody is remote and everyone has to use online tools, even in a world where teleworking, remote work is the norm, I still think there are certain activities that are just more efficient in person. I had this conversation very recently with a company where we were talking about building a roadmap, agreeing on a roadmap, and then working with the team to build stories off of that roadmap, sort of like a safe PI planning, but at a smaller scale, a smaller company with maybe 2 teams, right? You wouldn't really you'd have like a sort of a big room planning, but it wouldn't really be as involved. It wouldn't require as much overhead as a safe model. But in that instance, I lobbied to say that my personal belief was that it would be more efficient for me to fly into wherever the corporate headquarters, to fly the product owner, scrum master, maybe some of the key team members in to meet with the leadership stakeholders in that instance to come up with a roadmap. So this was a company that needed to revisit the road mapping, which I've talked about this before, not very often, but I don't like to go back to the road mapping step on a regular basis because it's sort of like like a soft reset of your backlog. So I don't like to revisit it all the time. But in this case, when I was coming on for the first time, I needed to make sure that the roadmap was stable, that it encompassed everything, that there was buy-in, consensus, and those things just go much, much, much faster in person. There are tools to make them way more efficient when you're doing remote, certainly, but that's just my personal belief that it's way more efficient for me to be there in person, to be able to write on the whiteboard, get interaction, see people's body language, and that sort of thing. Working software is the primary measure of progress. Let's talk about this one for a second. Working software is a primary measure of progress. So if you've ever been in a job interview for a Scrum Master or for a product owner or product manager, they will ask you, well, Mo, what metrics are important for the team? And I would propose, in case you don't like the word posit, I would propose that this is the appropriate answer. Working software is a primary measure of progress, right? Now, I would propose that this is the correct answer. However, it's probably not the answer that they're looking for. How often are we releasing working software to our customers, right? That should be the primary measure of progress. And then every other measure of progress should be subsequent or secondary to this one. So number one, how often are we releasing working software to our customers? Well, what does that look like? Now, you can measure your releases because every time you do a release, every time you send a release pipeline through to production or whatever environment customers get to see it in, you will know that. You'll be able to note it on a calendar or a graph or whatever. That is pretty straightforward. Now, if you are tracking business value to your stories, for example, if you put a business value to each story, you'll be able to track the amount of business value of all of your stories together, added up inside of each release. So let's say that you release, let's say you have 2 9s and a couple lower value items. So you have, you have 4 items equaling, 24 points of business value, right? Where the business value scale is 1 to 10, right? And let's say every week you're releasing software, or maybe every 2 weeks you release software. So now you have a measure, and you can see on a scale of the business value sent out to your customers every 2 weeks, right? At that point, when you're dealing with multiple teams, you're going to have to standardize business value between all the product owners so that you're kind of reporting equally. You come to a certain level of complexity at that point, but that also assumes you have multiple product owners, multiple product lines. And that's kind of a different problem. But this item is understated a lot of times. I see a lot of metrics being tracked that are not necessarily as important as this one. And I even did a whole podcast on different metrics, and this was not in the metrics that I said that I would look at, right? Because I guess it's sort of taken for granted in that I would always have this one as the number one thing is, what do our releases look like? How often are we sending things out? And of the things we're sending out, how valuable are they? This should be the number one thing, I would think. Anyway, to move along, number 8, Agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. So this item kind of speaks for itself. If you're a developer or anyone who's on development teams or interacts with development teams, you can't be burning your development teams every sprint, coming down to the wire. In the waterfall days, project management, what you would have is you'd have a race with your business analyst. You'd have a race to get the requirements in, to get them all gathered by a certain date so that your development teams that are being spun up can start, and your business analyst would have to complete the requirements and get 100% of the requirements done, and they'd have to get sign off from all the stakeholders that this is 100% of the requirements that we want, and everything is done in detail. And then they'd pass that, and then the pressure would be off of them. They'd have to meet a deadline. Then they'd have to pass it over to the developers. The developers would have to look it over and decide how they're going to do everything. And they'd have to submit their designs, and they have to submit their changes to requirements, or ask their questions, and they'd have to get 100% of their designs done. And then they start coding, and then they have to get 100% of the application done, and then they'd pass to the QA team, and the QA team would have to have 100% of their test plans done, and they'd have to walk through 100% of their test plans and show coverage, and et cetera, et cetera. And then when they're done, there'd probably be some kind of formal UAT phase with some kind of aftercare, hypercare period where developers have to go back and make some changes based out of UAT phase, have to go through QA again, have to go through UAT again. In all those phases, you're competing to hit a date. And the closer you get to the date, the more and more hours and the more frantic your project becomes. The more and more hours your developers work or your other team members work, and the more frantic your development efforts become. This item seeks to move past all that by just saying, look, we know what our capacity is for the team. We know how many people we have on the team. We know how many hours we're working per day. Let's just set that in stone, and we know we can just do what we can do. Right? That's this item. So every single item that the team works on cannot be a fire. The team cannot be firefighting 24/7. And I think everybody can agree on this one. I would hope that we can't run a business where everybody's in firefighting mode all of the time. The business will never pull ahead. You'll never be poised for success. And also there's a certain mentality that comes with always being in firefighter mode, right? If you never know when your next job is going to be, you never know where it's going to be, you never know what it's going to be, you never know if it's going to be a small smoldering fire or a raging inferno, how are you ever going to plan to do anything? And there's a bunch of other complexities that I'm leaving out here in software development, refactoring, trying to figure out migrating hardware/software packages, trying to take an old mobile application offline and switch over to a new one. There's a lot of different types of things here that deal with sustainability that I'm kind of skipping over in order to say a team built on always reacting is not going to be a successful team. And they're not going to write the best software, and they're not going to produce the best work that they can. That one kind of dovetails directly into number 9, continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design. So let's think about that for a second in terms of what I am 100% certain that most companies do not do, which is dedicate themselves to test automation, right? So if you say, before I send a feature out to production, I want to have some sort of test automation, not just unit testing, but test automation in place for this feature. Right? Feature flag, turn it on, turn it off, but also test automation, which is, I'm going to assume test automation also assumes that automation and the results thereof are collected in some kind of report that are sent out for a test manager or manager of product development to look at to know whether X percentage of the features of the application are behaving correctly or have issues, and they can look at and make a decision whether to send the release through to the next environment of production or whatever environment is the next environment. So this item, technical excellence and good design, this item usually is in conflict with either arbitrary deadlines or getting things done as fast as possible and out to customers as fast as possible. That's what I normally have observed this item being in contention with. So continuous attention to technical excellence and good design to me means that it doesn't mean that we cannot occasionally take a risk, right? That's not what this means. It does not mean that we always have to operate in what's perceived as a slow manner or method, meaning that every box has to be checked. However, I would seriously question if, again, now we're back in firefighting mode, I would seriously question if you're constantly making changes and not taking into consideration the speed or performance or impact on your ecosystem or impact on your larger design of your application, if those things are not considered along the way about building things, I think it would be fairly apparent that these things are not being taken into consideration by your methods and practices falling behind over time. Like I said before, do you have automated tests in place? Do you have good unit test coverage? Do you have continuous delivery? Do you have the CI/CD in place? Are your environment automatically being rolled out through the pipeline? Is there some kind of deployment architecture, deployment method in place, and is it successful? Do you have some sort of shared practices between your developers? From what I've seen, either these things are in place and are the cornerstone and really non-negotiable in your development process, or not. And that's really it. It's really either a commitment to it or not, that I've seen in my experience. Wow, that's frustrating, right? Number 10, simplicity. The art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. Yeah, simplicity is essential. In product, when you're asked to give examples about simplicity, I think the one that everyone goes back to automatically is Google's search page. Oh, it's just a blank page with a search bar, and it's intentionally simple like that. I guess it's a great example, right? Because it is pretty simple. But to take it a step deeper, to take it a little bit deeper and a step down closer to where this is going, the simplicity in here is, from a product perspective, why have a backlog that's several hundred items when you have 150 of those items that never get pulled into a sprint in a couple months? So you've gone 10, 12 sprints and you haven't pulled any of the items that are at the lower part of the backlog in, and they've been waiting that long. Why have those items at all? I think this is one of the things that kind of suffers in the domain of product management is what is the goal of your application, and then what features are you building? What is the goal of your application? What is the goal of your company? I probably should have listed those in a different order. What is the goal of your company? And then how is the application going to help your company achieve those goals? And then when you finally get to a backlog with those items at the top, the items that have less business value and are less priority, I would think they would stay open for a certain amount of time and then just be closed, as we will not implement them. And as a product owner / manager, you most likely are the appropriate person to make the call to say, hey, these are good ideas, but the business value is not here, and we're going to close them. And the nice thing about closing them is they're documented as, hey, somebody did come up with this idea, we talked about it, and we decided together we're not going to do it, and here's the reasons. And you should be able to stand by that, I would think. Maybe you can open it back up later if something changes, if some kind of market conditions change, or opinions change, or customer feedback changes. But I think the product person is the most appropriate person to make those determinations. But I don't exactly know what the time frame would be. For me, when I was a product manager, it would be a couple months, so maybe 5-6 sprints. If something didn't get any attention at all, I would flag those items to start looking at in my refinements, to kick out, to close, and say, hey, we're not going to do this. Yeah, there's a lot to be said about simplicity. Speaking of simplicity, I was also involved one time with a company that they built a mobile application, and it was a good mobile application, but the company had two sides, a customer user side, and those customers could call on technicians to come help them with their problems. So it was a customer side and a technician side. And they both use the same mobile app. And one of the things, when the company called me in as a product manager, they said, look, we've got an app that sort of fits both audiences, but we really think it would be a better experience for both the customers and the technicians to have their own application that just suits just their needs, which was a great idea, and I 100% supported it. We ended up designing an application that gave the customer a great experience, and a separate application that gave the technician their own specific experience, because the customer's needs and the technician's needs were completely separate. And also the technician may work for other companies that have their own applications, so their needs of the application were very bare bones, and they needed efficiency over everything else. Whereas a customer, they needed information over efficiency. They needed to see a high-level snapshot and a few other things. Efficiency was not their number one concern, right? So that would be an example of, if we were to make one application and the users only had one view, you would have a sub-optimized view. We would be trying to balance the customers and the technicians' views in the same application, and that wouldn't really work out. So simplicity could mean leading to more work, depending on where your app came from and what happened in the market up until this point. Number 11, the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. This is another one that kind of have the pleasure, when I've been a Scrum Master on teams, I kind of had the pleasure to see this one happen in real time. So what will happen is I'll be a Scrum Master, I'll come in with a team, and I'll help shepherd the team through the forming, storming, norming, phases. And I always know that I'm in the forming/norming phase when we're in refinements and sprint plannings, and the team members start pitching requirements to the product owner. Maybe if we added this button, or maybe if we made this button do this instead of whatever, it'd be a little better user experience. I really feel that if you are not getting, I don't know what the percentage is. I don't know if there's a market percentage for this, but if you're not getting suggestions out of your team, so it would, like, requirements suggestions, either amendments to your story or ways to break your story or new stories that you create. If you're not getting suggestions out of your team, you might want to ask your Scrum Master, hey, what phase in Tuckman's model, Tuckman, Bob Tuckman, Cletus Tuckman, Chuck Tuckman. Oh, man. Tuckman. I can't take that guy anywhere. Oh, no. Bruce Tuckman. Who would have guessed? Now, I'll leave that one open to interpretation. You feel free to Google that one. But no, I always know I'm in a certain stage of Tuckman's model when the team first starts throwing out suggestions to the product owner for requirements that they can build into the product to make it better, right? Because at a certain point, when you have a team that's not suggesting, they're just taking what the product owner and the business or the technical leads or whatever tell them to do. They're just taking what they're instructed to perform and doing it. You have a team that's still in the forming stage. You have a team that is just, they want to be quiet and they're walking on eggshells and they're just trying to do what you tell them, and they're not really questioning anything or giving a lot of feedback to you. And I don't know. I'm not trying to make a statement whether that's a bad thing. However, the best teams will give input into the design and requirements and architecture of the application. Self-organizing team, also known as self-managing teams. The final item, number 12, at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more efficient, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. Obviously, the number one thing that'll stick out in people's mind that use the Scrum model will be retrospectives, right? But you can have a retrospective in a typical project management command and control type of project. You could have retrospectives. Usually they're done when the whole project is over. They're, after action review type of situation when the whole project is over. You could build them in earlier, obviously. I don't know how effective they would be built in earlier since most of the work is analyzed or spec'd out up front. But, it's certainly possible. What you do with this, the team reflecting on ways to become more effective. The Scrum model obviously has a way to deal with this. You do your retrospective, you take your feedback, and then you iterate on it with the team's working model that the team utilizes. You iterate on it and try to get better. Obviously, the Scrum model doesn't go into how you do that, but you can do that in other models. You can do that in Kanban. You can do that in other models as well. You can have regular touch points to sit down and talk about it, and we talked about it in a previous episode, to have time to sit down and go over every week, possibly even every day, to fill in your time every day for reflection on how you could be improving. Retrospection? That's not a real word. But number 12, I feel is probably baked in a bit more. So I wanted to hit these values. I wanted to hit these principles of Agile because if you are in an organization where you are finding that your leadership, or maybe some other people that you interact with, or maybe your delivery lead, or whatever you have I don't know if you have in a larger organization or smaller organization, Agile project manager, delivery lead, or whoever you work around, or whoever's in maybe you're in a matrix environment and all these people on the same level. if you're finding that your dedication to agility or some of the things that you learned about Scrum are not being taken as seriously, or you feel that your organization's wavering a little bit on their dedication to these things, you might want to run through the principles of Agile in order to have a more concrete list of items which you can present during your feedback at whatever opportunity you have. Hey, maybe we need to focus on this item in order to start a conversation. Because a lot of times what happens in the Scrum model pretty easily can be used to disguise normal waterfall project management. You can take the Scrum events and you can implement the Scrum events and claim that you're operating as an Agile company fairly easily and not actually change any of your command and control principles through which your company operates on. Obviously, number one, the highest priority to satisfy is the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. That's a pretty good indicator. If you're only delivering to the customer every several months and you're not bringing the customer in for feedback, but every couple months, obviously there's some sort of conflict in the culture of your organization. If you do not welcome change in your development cycle, there's some kind of conflict that has been identified. Maybe it's just a feeling, but these are principles you can come back to sort of challenge your organization to say, are we really dedicated to being agile? Are we truly an agile organization? And you can also sort of use these as a test of your organization to understand whether agile is just being used as like a marketing term, or if you're in a larger company where the larger company has decided that agility is a way, but your division or department of the larger company seems lagging behind or is agile in name only. You can use these principles to rate yourself to figure out if agility truly is at the core of your group or department or company, or if it's just something that's being invoked in name only. I know I kind of breezed through all 12 of these items pretty quickly in this session. I know I probably could sit down again with a co-host on a normal podcast and rip through each one of these and talk a little more in depth about experiences. I still think there's value in doing that. I might do that in the future. But until then, feel free to comment below. Subscribe to the channel if you've not subscribed yet. And I'd like to hear your feedback. And in lieu of all that, agilepodcastquestions@gmail.com. I don't really like solo podcasts, but solo podcasts is better than no podcast.